Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I'm your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series, along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. Today, my guest and fellow stranger Amee Schmidt is here to discuss the Uncanny X-Men and the Dark Phoenix Saga. Welcome back, strangers. This week, I'm joined by my friends, Amee. Amee, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and what you do.
Hi, my name is Amee, and I am an English professor. I teach a lot of writing, but also I teach literature and literary theory. I am also a writer. I write fiction. I love fantasy fiction. I love sci-fi fiction. Pretty much any kind of fiction. I tried to get into the nonfiction reading thing, as a big trend for a while, but that's not really up my alley. I'm also a big old nerd, have been since the day I was born. So pretty much anything that has to do with superheroes or fantasy is definitely everything that I see and I love.
Awesome. One of us.
Yes, one of us. I will say, because we are talking a little bit about X-Men today, I teach the X-Men Apocalypse film in my composition courses. Yes. It goes up against the Guardians of the Galaxy, and the students have choices to make. They can choose one of the two films to claim who is the hero. And then they have to prove that in a sort of like academic argumentative essay. It's a great way to teach that element of argumentation through a medium that they're really familiar with. So
I love that idea.
Yeah, it's great.
Awesome.
It's fun. So much fun.
Awesome. So today we're talking about the X-Men, or the Uncanny X-Men as it is actually known. Tell us a little bit about your experience or history with the X-Men. How were you introduced to it?
So I am technically not an 80s kid because I was born in 1981. So I was not old enough to read the X-Men comics, but my slightly older cousin, he's about 5 years older than me, was a huge X-Men fan and had the comic books, and we would see each other a couple times a year. And he would always come and explain to me what happened in the previous story, and then would read the comics to me and my other cousins while we were, sitting around for Thanksgiving or Easter or whatever happened to be that we were at Grandma's house in the basement. So I remember that the Dark Phoenix Saga was one of those sets that he would tell us about, and he was really into that saga, and so he would teach us, quote unquote, teach us about it while we were there. And then he also started collecting the cards. And once I started seeing the cards, and he would get duplicates and sometimes let us younger kids have his copies. And so I still have some locked away in my chest somewhere. Yeah, I wanted to dig those out, and I cannot seem to figure out how to get into my chest at the moment. So I'll find those at some point. I'll have to show you. And then my next experience, because of the experience that I had with my cousin, I watched the cartoon when I was a kid. So the Sunday morning cartoon version of the X-Men was really where I got most of my experience. Then, of course, when I was in the early, mid 90s, right, that the first X-Men movie set was, did they make 3 of those films?
Oh, more than that by now. Yeah.
Okay. But that particular timeline from the 90s, when we had when we first saw Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, and we had Famke Janssen as the Dark Phoenix, and that was, as far as I'm concerned, a completely different storyline, completely different interpretation of the story than what we have now in the mid 2000s, when they started making this newer interpretation of that particular. And we get I can't think of her name, Sansa Stark.
I know who you're talking about. I'm not a big Game of Thrones person.
I can't think of her name. It's the actress who they transferred, right? She made it into the Jean Grey. Sophie, yes. Yeah. So then the way that they've used her to totally reinterpret the Dark Phoenix Saga. One of the things that you mentioned in one of your earlier podcasts is how unsuccessfully they've done it both times. And I think that that's entirely true, but it's also really interesting, right? Like, to see how different interpretations of a written text come out into a visual text. So, and I'm a geek, I'm a Marvel geek. Like, I love everything there is to love about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as well as the Marvel, comic universe, right? All of those things really are part of my geekdom. So,
what do you think of X3? Because that is a fairly controversial entry in the films.
I'm struggling to remember X3. Can you remind me the plot?
Basically, that's a loose adaptation of the Dark Phoenix Saga, or they use elements of it.
Is that where they end up in the dam and the Dark Phoenix, or did that happen at the end of X2?
That was at the end of X2. That's when Jean basically dies and then is resurrected as the Dark Phoenix.
Yeah.
X3 is the one about the mutant cure.
Okay, yes. Yeah. So, and then, so they reinterpreted the Hellfire group, right, as a group led by Magneto.
Basically, yes.
Yeah. And so it doesn't have the same sort of external, like completely external to the original X-Men group. And there's not as much. So that's what I find particularly interesting of all the interpretations, is how much external influence on Jean Grey comes from other people. Okay. Whereas in the original storyline, that influence is more internal, right? That more happens inside of her own person, and there are non-human forces at work.
The conversion to Dark Phoenix is very much an internal process within her. I mean, she is being manipulated by other people, the Hellfire Club, obviously. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the internal mechanism to that switch from light to dark is within her. Yeah, X3, like I said, it's a controversial entry in the film franchise. I like it, but then I have a really low sort of threshold for entertainment. As long as I'm entertained for a couple hours, that's really all I care about. And so I do find it to be entertaining. I do think it is somewhat inferior to some of the other films, but I enjoyed it for the most part. But yeah, it is a reimagining of that particular storyline.
I will say the one thing that is particularly good about X3 is the physical appearance of Jean Grey's transformation. Yes. I do like the way that they did that, because I don't think that they do that particularly well anywhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you do mention the 90s cartoon, and I'm a little bit older than you. I was born in the 70s.
Right.
And so I didn't really see the 90s cartoon much at the time that it was broadcast. I saw a few episodes of it. I really didn't watch it until many years later when it was streaming. But they do a really good job of adapting many of these storylines from the comics, especially this particular one.
They do. They really and they simplified it for their audience, right? Like the audience was clearly going to be children. And what works incredibly well are the characterizations, right? They've really, for lack of a better word that I can't think of right now, but they've stereotyped each of the characters so that Wolverine is Wolverine.
Yes.
And Jean Grey has this very distinct change of character, right? Like from And they were creating a serial experience, right? Like where you have a week to week, growth of the characters that you got to see. And that, I think, gave them the space they needed in order to do a better job with the plot line.
I mean, it is somewhat simplified, as you notice, especially in the character development, and sanitized to some extent, because obviously it doesn't have the raciness or the risque aspect that the actual comic books do. But yeah, it is a fairly close adaptation. Now, looking back at my experience with the X-Men, I did grow up in the 80s and I did read X-Men comics, but my first introduction came through a collection that I picked up at my local public library. And I don't know what they did. I don't know if they took like trade paperbacks and then bound them together, but I just remember that going to the library, they would have these collections of certain comic books, and they had their own sort of hardcover put onto them. Mm-hmm. With it looks like they would cut a cover from the magazine or from the comic and paste that into the onto the cover of the hardcover of the book. So it was kind of janky, basically, is what I'm getting at here. It's kind of a homemade collection or anthology of these books. And they had several titles, X-Men being one of them. They had Spider-Man, Superman, Fantastic Four, and Iron Man. And that's pretty much my introduction to so many of those characters. Now, I do remember the Spider-Man Saturday morning cartoons, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which did introduce some of those characters, and some of the X-Men were on there. Mm-hmm. But it's really in that collection when I want to say about 9 years old, that I picked up at the library. And that collection was the entire Phoenix storyline. So it began with the death of Jean Grey, the resurrection as the Phoenix. It goes into the Shi'ar conflict, and then it ends basically right here with the end of the Dark Phoenix storyline. And I loved it. And I was a kid who grew up with Star Wars and all of that sort of space opera stuff anyway, so this really appealed to me because of that. Do you have any favorite characters?
My favorite character since childhood and continuing to this day has been and always will be Raven. I'm sorry, Rogue, who they eliminated in the re-envisioned version of the X-Men that they put out in the mid-2000s, which really ticked me off. Rogue was always an important character for me because she could be any hero she wanted to be. And for me, that just made her the best, right? She could take anybody's power she wanted to and be the ultimate superhero. So I always pretended that I was Rogue when I was a child.
Nice. Now, you had mentioned in the 90s cartoon of how Wolverine was Wolverine. And of course, he is regarded as probably the most popular of the X-Men. I didn't really like him that much when I was a kid. But of course, my introduction to him was in the comics, where he's really a creep.
Yes.
More than he is in the cartoons, and certainly in the movies where he's all super sexy, Hugh Jackman. My favorite characters were Nightcrawler and Storm, actually. It's because, Nightcrawler, I mean, he had the Spider-Man abilities of being a wall crawler, but he could also like disappear into shadow, and he could teleport. I'm like, dude, how is this not the coolest thing ever, right? Mm-hmm. And then Storm controlled the weather. This was just really amazing to me. Compared to, back when I was a kid, when it came to comic books, you were either a DC fan or a Marvel fan. And, Marvel's tagline used to be "Make Mine Marvel." And so I was a huge Marvel fan. DC characters, their superheroes were the sort of perfect godlike beings who could do no wrong. Whereas, of course, Marvel had the more sort of complicated characters with complicated lives. And so that was more relatable for me. But yeah, Nightcrawler and Storm, those were the coolest. Wolverine, yeah, he was cool, but he's really a dick. So I didn't really care about that.
I do remember I was not a big Wolverine fan, more so because my little brother was. And so he had, I don't know, a half dozen Wolverine action figures, and I'm sure he had a Wolverine Trapper Keeper and whatever else.
I did have a Wolverine action figure. I will say that.
But yeah, as a character, he was definitely not my favorite. I did connect to Storm immensely as well because she could fly. You know, there aren't,
Yes.
that's something in the DC universe, the heroes can fly. Like Superman can fly. Why not? Spider-Man almost can fly. You know, there's all kinds of flying that happens, but there aren't very many flying characters in X-Men. In Marvel, more so as a larger universe, but in the X-Men, there aren't many who can just fly at will.
And another thing about Marvel characters is their powers are very much rooted in science as opposed to just being a godlike something that's part of who they are. So when you do have like Iron Man who's flying, well, he's got jets in his suit. That's what allows him to do it. So most of the flyers in Marvel, they have some sort of apparatus that makes them able to fly, which makes it, I think, more relatable again. You know, I can't fly on my own, but, you know, give me a jetpack. There you go. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the X-Men. And do you know a whole lot about the history?
I don't. My first experience is the 1980s versions, which were written by, is it Chris
Claremont.
Yeah, Chris Claremont. So that was the very first experience that I had, which I realize is a little later in the game than when it began.
A little bit, although that is the best known version of the X-Men. So it was created originally in '63 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who pretty much created just about everything in the Marvel universe up to that point. But it wasn't really a popular series. In fact, was canceled. Well, I mean, I don't know if we can say it was canceled in 1970 because it's still published through the early part of the 70s, but it was reprints and reissues. So no new stories were being told until 1975 when it was rebooted by Len Wein and Dave Cockrum. And they're the ones who introduced the characters that everyone knows and loves. So the original X-Men, there were Cyclops and Jean Grey. You had Beast in there, you had Iceman, and then you had Angel. But the characters that people know now and that associate with the X-Men, such as Wolverine and Storm and Nightcrawler, those were created by Wein and Cockrum in '75. And then it was, I want to say 1978 when Chris Claremont came on as the writer. And John Byrne was the artist, the primary artist, although he did collaborate with Claremont on plotting and coming up with the stories. And so they're the ones who are responsible for this particular storyline of the Dark Phoenix Saga in 1980. And this storyline is, first of all, it's one of the most recognized and celebrated storylines in comics history. And it sees the introduction of many characters who would go on to become fan favorites or have a larger influence on the X-Men universe. So it's the first appearance of the Hellfire Club and Emma Frost. First appearance of Kitty Pryde, who is a fan favorite character. And I think it's interesting that when she's introduced, she doesn't like Wolverine. She thinks he's a creep. But yet later on, they will become very close friends. And they are sort of recognized as a team between the two of them. It's the first appearance of Dazzler, and we'll get to Dazzler. And of course, the first appearance of Dark Phoenix. So this is a highly celebrated storyline. It's also one that's just very well known and very popular. And in fact, we see that referenced in Stranger Things in the very first episode. And this storyline has a lot of influence, as we were talking about before we started recording, a lot of influence on the story of Stranger Things. So let's get into looking at this particular storyline. First, let me ask you, what do you think of Dazzler?
I'm not sure that I'm familiar with Dazzler, to tell you the truth.
So Dazzler, I never really got the appeal of Dazzler. She is the disco mutant who's introduced here. Her powers are she can turn sound vibrations into light and dazzle people. She was really popular in the early 80s. And in fact, she had her own comic line, her own book, her own title. There was, they planned a movie about Dazzler, which would have starred Bo Derek. Yeah, really the pretty much, like I said, the disco mutant, and I never really understood the appeal to that. Possibly because, yeah, I was born in the 70s, but disco was never really my thing. So maybe I can't relate to it on that level. But yeah, she's just to me a really goofy character. What do you think about any of these other characters?
I am mostly familiar. So as I mentioned earlier, I learned of these stories through, either my cousin summarizing them to me, or he would read like individual issues, and we would get through maybe one issue a weekend when we had family get-togethers. So he didn't tell me about Dazzler, which means that he was not impressed with her either. And I only vaguely remember mentions of Kitty Pryde, right? So I do remember that there was that rivalry existed between Kitty Pryde and Wolverine, and that was something that was kind of something that my cousin had latched onto, and so he would tell us about how that happened. I remember as a kid being sort of like I don't know, validated in my dislike of Wolverine because of her. So I related to her in some ways. But what I do remember about the most about is the Hellfire Club as like this entity that I desperately wanted Jean Grey to stay away from.
Okay.
And that was something that I really connected to as a young child, like thinking about, who are the important people, because we were the X-Men, right? We played as if we were the X-Men when we were kids. And so if our Jean Grey had disappeared, and nobody wanted to be Jean Grey before she was the Dark Phoenix, mind you, nobody said, oh, I'm Jean Grey, right? I was always Rogue. Christopher played Wolverine, so on and so forth. But then here comes the Hellfire Club, and we would like banish people to the Hellfire Club. Like, we would make up our own stories because this was such a bad place to go. So I do remember being pretty devastated by the fact that this club existed and that they were trying to destroy Jean Grey, who up to that point in my childhood mind was such a pure and innocent character. Yeah.
And I don't know if they really want to destroy her so much as use her to gain more power, and certainly that's what Mastermind or Jason Wingard wants to do with her. But
we're talking. Oh, sorry, I was just talking about my childhood mind. Like my childhood mind associated that with the destruction of Jean Grey, which, in a lot of ways, it is, right. It's a complete changeover of personalities, which makes her a completely different person.
Absolutely. And you had mentioned that you were the X-Men, you played as the X-Men.
Yes.
But I think that's a good point about the X-Men, is that it's so easy to sort of project yourself onto these characters, partly because they're written to be so relatable, but also just the concept of the X-Men. Stan Lee has said that when he wanted to come up with a new team of superheroes, he was tired of trying to think of ways for them to get their powers, right? Peter Parker, okay, there was the radioactive spider. The Hulk was exposed to gamma radiation. Well, what if you just have these powers be a part of who they are? Just make them mutants, right? And so that idea of the mutant becomes a metaphor for so many different sort of otherness within our society, and so many different groups who have been marginalized historically and traditionally have gravitated to the X-Men and have recognized themselves in it. I'm going to let you take over a bit here. Tell us about this story and what's going on here.
All right. So in my experience, there, no matter which way you look at the interpretation of the story, there's some clear elements, right? So Jean Grey starts as a character really hesitant, withdrawn, not necessarily willing to embrace her powers. I see this very much as an identity story, as a traveling through your psyche story. And that I think in a lot of ways is the reason that it's become so incredibly popular, is that not only is it exceptionally supernatural, and it really digs into the idea of, dark versus light, but also that it's so relatable because, I mean, if we're talking about psychoanalysis, everybody has this part, right? So Jean Grey starts out this way as a character, and then she develops or learns about, or however it comes about, or someone else gives her access to, depending on which interpretation you're looking at, this Dark Phoenix power,
right.
which may have been innate as part of her, or, in some storylines it's been induced by some sort of supernatural
and that's even a little unclear in the books itself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because the point is made that she is one of the most powerful mutants ever, that she has this innate ability that has to be sort of locked away. And then she's exposed to some sort of cosmic force, and it's unclear whether the Phoenix Force is that cosmic force or if it's something which activates that force within her.
Right. And so then when she does move over, the power sort of is fueled by anger and sort of darker emotions, both influenced by the Hellfire Club, and then also partially, her own feelings of questionings of identity and things along those lines.
And having to have suppressed certain aspects of herself. But also, I think you make a good point here in that usually when we see her sort of explode into the Dark Phoenix, or have that power explode a little bit more, it's in relation to Scott and Cyclops and how he gets harmed.
Absolutely. And so that's the emotional reactions are so huge for the way that the Dark Phoenix power comes forth. And then we see, and I'm a little hazy on the plot line, right? Because like I mentioned before, a lot of it was told to me. The things that I know for sure, at some point, the Dark Phoenix expels herself, or she is expelled to another galaxy altogether, right? And that's where we see her in a major conflict and causing an entire planetary destructions because of her inability to control that power, aka her inability to control her own emotions, or to accept and acknowledge the dark side of her own self. Eventually, she does come back to the X-Men. It's very much seen like a homecoming, and she returns, at least in most of the storylines, right? She returns to her Jean Grey status, and or she dies, right?
Well, she does limit her own power.
Okay, yeah.
Because she wants to regain that Jean Grey identity.
All right, and I wasn't sure how many of the storylines she actually dies in, but that, again, symbolic of a recognition of one's entire humanity, right? Like how it is that we understand our whole identity, both dark and light, and her ability to, find balance. So instead of being Jean Grey or Dark Phoenix, she becomes her whole self, and then is able to do that. And that is, so that's always been the interpretive understanding I've had of that entire saga. And I feel like I said, it's really a strong one. And I feel like we should be giving this entire book series to adolescents, right? Like here, yes. Learn how to be a grown person. Absolutely. Because it's incredibly impactful. And I remember that story has stuck with me my whole life. And I remember early on with the Famke Janssen, Dark Phoenix, Jean Grey coming up. The first time I saw her, I'm like, oh, they've got Jean Grey in here. I'm so excited. She's going to be the Phoenix. And then it took forever for them to make her into the Phoenix. And then when they did, it wasn't exactly the way that I remembered it. But I think that transition, that psychological transition, still happened.
Very much so. And I think you make a good point about how she wants to return and kind of return on her own terms, because she has been manipulated by all of these figures, both the X-Men, specifically Professor X, which, let me just make a little aside here. Most people, I think, are familiar with Professor Xavier as depicted by Patrick Stewart and James McAvoy as a very benevolent figure. When you go back and read these comics, he's really a dick.
Yeah.
And so Professor X has manipulated Jean. The Hellfire Club has manipulated Jean. And when she does return, like I said, it is on her own terms. She's come to some sort of decision and choice about herself. So she's acting under her, literally her own power.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I'd like to talk about Professor X, because he really is, even in the movie adaptations, and I don't know if this is because I saw him for what he really was and the experiences of the comics, but I do feel like he's not 100% a good person, right? He has messed with Jean Grey's brain in a really severe way, right? To the point that, he's locked her away from who she really is. Mm-hmm. And that is,
for her own good, he thinks.
For her own good, right? And that is, we could talk forever about the feminist implications of that as well. But in that particular in that particular situation, he's very much the cause for the explosion of the Dark Phoenix, right? The Dark Phoenix very much could have been a slow growth, a slow understanding of the dark side of the psyche, but instead, because it was blocked off for such a long time, it exploded out, and that's where we get the very tragic results of what happens after she does explode.
Like you say, he's not entirely a good guy, and in many ways, he has his own agenda in the way that Magneto does. He's just going about achieving it in a different way. So he is very sort of arrogant and has his own ideas of what is best for mutant kind and for the world in general. And he's trying to do that his own self, to accomplish his own ends. There was something else I was going to mention. Oh, the idea of tragedy. How do we see this as a tragedy?
She's a tragic hero.
Yes, she is.
Absolutely.
Well, if you look at it from that formalist perspective of, what is a tragedy? A tragedy is a linear story that you have this figure, a very powerful figure, who has some sort of flaw, usually some kind of arrogance or hubris, which leads to their own downfall. So you have a situation where something is wrong in the world, and that wrong thing is caused by the hero. And in order to save the world, the hero has to be eliminated in some way.
Yeah, that is really phenomenal. So my brain got a little distracted with the idea of Professor X as the tragic hero, but because he fits that incredibly well. But if we look at the Dark Phoenix as the flaw that Jean Grey has, and then the way that Dark Phoenix creates or causes this enormous, entire planetary destruction, that's a pretty major problem. And we find out later in the storyline that problem doesn't just go away after Jean Grey decides to sort of self-destroy that flaw, right? Like she's in a sense destroyed part of the bad side of her while also accepting it. And then, but then later in the storyline, after she comes back to the X-Men, these other, it's the Kree and some other alien organizations come and demand, that retribution is made. And so this issue that was caused by, that we as readers want to say has been resolved, turns out was not entirely resolved, but definitely like 100% a tragedy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this ultimately leads to the death of Jean Grey. So do you want to talk about that?
If I could remember exactly how that happened, I would, but I don't.
Okay. So, she's basically put on galactic trial for destroying this star system. And more specifically, the one inhabited planet within this star system is destroyed because she takes in the energy of the sun and creates a supernova, which wipes out that planet. And so it is decreed that she and the X-Men will have to go through a trial by combat in order to resolve this issue. And she goes into this trial with the intention of sacrificing herself. And that's basically what happens. All the other X-Men are defeated, and she's left at a point where, you know, she has to defend Scott, Cyclops, and it's that point that she uses her powers to activate an alien weapon that disintegrates her.
That's the act of and now that you're reminding me of it, I thank you for that. That the act of the disintegration of her is very much the culmination of any tragic hero story, right? Not only does she sacrifice herself, which again is a tragic hero, right? They have to atone for
Yes.
that flaw that happens, but she makes it so that there's no trace whatsoever that you know what I mean? There's no body left over. There's no possibility for any kind of ceremony that happens after. It is just the end, right? Like, so we get that credit line, the end, because she's gone. Totally, possibly unrelated, but slightly connected is the discussion that you had in your first podcast about the vanishing of Will Byers, right? So another idea that things have just kind of gone poof. And it's interesting how we see those connections coming through, like, I don't know.
Oh, and we'll definitely dive into those because there's a lot of connections going on here.
So much.
So yeah, I just want to take a look at the final page of this particular storyline because it's kind of interesting in that we've been following what happens with the X-Men sort of from their perspective. But in the last issue of this particular story arc, the Watcher comes in, and we're seeing it from his perspective a little bit more. He's explaining what's going on, which kind of comes out of nowhere. And I think it's interesting when you look at the history of what's happening with the publication of the storyline. It was controversial at the time amongst the people at Marvel. Apparently, the writers and the editors had agreed that, okay, here's the basic elements of the story. The editor-in-chief at the time, Jim Shooter, whom I met a few years ago at a convention, wasn't aware that they had planned on using Dark Phoenix to destroy a planet. You make the point that for the readers, we see her atone for that on her own, and so she does get a redemption. But for Jim Shooter, he felt that that personal redemption wasn't enough for this monstrous act that she created, and so something had to be done in order to really punish her more. And so that's when it was decided that she would die for what she did. And so I just want to look at the final page. This is where the Watcher, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Watcher is introduced in this last issue, is because it's a way of distancing the reader from the storyline a little bit more to get that moral statement. I am the Recorder, a non-cellular humanoid created by the colonizers of Rigel to think and to record. I have observed all that has transpired here, yet I do not comprehend the meaning of these events. My historical circuits inform me that Jean Grey was counted a force for good on Earth. As Phoenix, her power saved the entire universe from extinction, yet she was hounded unto death. Interrogative, why? And then the Watcher responds, because she was human. Insufficient answer, Watcher. Please elucidate further. All beings carry within them a capacity for good and evil. All our actions result from the interaction of these two fundamental forces. Our reason makes us aware of these forces and likewise gives us the responsibility of choosing between them. Regrettably, not all choices are clear-cut, nor all conflicts obvious. This child achieved a level of power that placed her as far above humanity on the evolutionary scale as they are above the amoeba. She had only to think, and that thought would become instant reality. But the Phoenix is also a force of primal passion, and Homo sapiens is still as much a creature of passion as of intellect. Such passion is by its very nature seductive and violent. Jean could not help but respond to it, be changed by it, and in time overwhelmed. So she briefly became the dark side of Phoenix, the Black Angel, Chaos Bringer. Yet, when faced with a choice between keeping her godlike power, knowing she would then wreak death and destruction across the stars, and dying herself, she chose the latter. That is what makes humanity virtually unique in the cosmos, my friend. This extraordinary capacity for self-sacrifice. This ability to triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles if the cause be just, knowing all the while that to do so means certain death. The X-Men do not realize it. They may never realize or accept it, but this day they have won perhaps the greatest victory of their young lives. Jean Grey could have lived to become a god, but it was more important to her that she die a human. Any thoughts on this?
That last sentence is one of my favorites, right? Because it is the way that it is the way that we're told very explicitly to understand it. And I think that's the way that so many of us have understood it anyway. But I think that it's interesting that you found out that the editor was so concerned that people wouldn't get that message that he had to have someone say it out loud. Because it's apparent that Jean has come to an understanding of herself as a human with these extra powers, and that she chooses humanity over power. And that's what makes her, such an extraordinary hero, because she does choose that sacrifice.
Yes. So how does this relate then to Stranger Things? We've been moving towards this discussion.
Absolutely. Holy crap. So everything, I think 11 as a character, her character arc parallels that of Jean Grey's into the Dark Phoenix. I mean, like line by line, it really is astonishing. After you had mentioned that that's what we were going to talk about, and I started looking into the TV show a little bit more deeply and thinking about it, and then I started just going, "Holy cow!" Right? Like I can hardly believe that there's so much there. So first and foremost, when we first meet 11, she doesn't use her powers. Right. She is, she's sort of, stripped bare, kind of the way Jean Grey's name is the most, black, blank canvas of a name that you can get. 11, as we mentioned, as you mentioned in an earlier episode, she's presented androgynous. She's in a gown, right? She doesn't even have a name. She has a number. Right. So we see this sort of reluctance in 11 as well to show her powers, to use her powers, to even accept that her powers are anything possible to be good. So
and she gets punished for refusing to use her powers.
Yes. Yeah. And so in so many ways, right? And then total side note, but something to maybe think about later. Papa is Professor X. How much there is as aligning is really kind of creepy now that we've been talking about the not great nature of him. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of season 1 is all Jean Grey, like all 11 as that sort of Jean Grey figure. And she starts to use her powers to a greater extent towards the end of season 1, and she sacrifices herself. But it's not a permanent sacrifice, right?
But we don't know that.
That's true.
At the end of the first season.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. For me, the majority of when we see 11 transform into the Dark Phoenix happens in season 2. In particular, when she sort of breaks out of the cabin and goes to find her sister.
And just to pause here, isn't it interesting that her sister's powers are the powers of illusion? Just as Mastermind in the Dark Phoenix. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I actually made that. And her sister is Kali.
It is called Kali, number 8, I believe, but she takes the name of Kali.
So lots of numerology happening in that season as well, which is something that's pretty interesting to think about. But yeah, so they call her Kali. So I made so many parallels between her and Mastermind as well. Before she gets to her sister, though, she has her mother's visions, right?
Yes.
So there's so many times that 11 goes under, right? I don't know what else to call it, but goes under, and she sees things. She sees things as if they're physical. But when she goes under, she enters her mother's mind and sees her mother's visions. Which for me paralleled Jean Grey's experiences with Lady Grey, and then later on the visions that she had where she transformed into the Black Queen, right? And that it might be a little loose there, but that was definitely something that felt like, you know, it was there's so many parallels. You just keep matching them up, and it's kind of crazy. So then that leads her to her sister, who is the leader of the Hellfire Club,
basically,
right? Like,
yeah.
What else are these kids that are, you know, they bring out the quote unquote bad side of 11, right? And so that's when we see 11. I mean, and 11 has killed before. She even says that she has killed before, and we know, you know, there have been casualties associated with Jean Grey prior to Dark Phoenix. This is when we see it's really the emotional connections there, right? So 11's powers really explode when she's with her sister. We see her move an entire train, you know, some 100 yards or something. And her sister, aka Mastermind, right, is egging her on, like, telling her, go find the anger, and that's that anger, that incredibly
dark side.
Yes, that dark side emotion that fuels 11 in the very same way that Jean is fueled with her dark anger, her dark side, as the Dark Phoenix. So
very much so. And this has been foreshadowed from the very first episode, when Will makes reference to X-Men number 134, which is the first appearance of Dark Phoenix. And yeah, we're definitely meant to equate Phoenix with 11. It's the same power set, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, like exact same power set, right? And an extreme power, right? Like we get her power early on, we get Jean Grey's power early on, but it's not until that moment, that movement into the dark side of the psyche, that she starts to really explode her power. And this all, I mean, the Dark Phoenix Saga happens for me in an episode, right? So because through the process of that, through that experience, she does eventually come to the realization that she remembers, you know, she has these flashbacks of her experience with her friends, with her X-Men group, right? So so the rest of the heroes in Stranger Things are very much the X-Men.
Yes.
You can make parallels between a number of characters in the X-Men and the Stranger Things. That's fascinatingly fun. But so then so she recognizes her good nature, that she's not in fact the monster, that she isn't just the bad side, and she goes back.
Yeah.
Some kind of interesting things pop up during that episode, which I just kind of want to pop out. Like, there's that neon sign in the bedroom when 11 and Kali are together, and that sign reads, it's a neon sign that reads spiritual advisor.
Right.
As if Mastermind or Kali is the person who is trying to help bring about, you know, an understanding for 11. And in some ways, maybe 11 wouldn't have been able to get to where she got without Kali, in the same way that maybe Jean Grey would not have been able to get to where she did without the interference of Mastermind.
And by the way, in case our listeners don't know, what's the reference in Kali's name?
I don't know.
Oh, you don't know Kali? Kali is the Hindu goddess of death and destruction.
Oh, very good. See, I was reading it as Kali, like the dog.
Oh, okay.
So that works actually. Oh boy, isn't that another rabbit hole?
Layer there? Yeah.
Isn't that another rabbit hole?
Oh yeah.
Rabbit hole to go down. Yeah. So yeah, so this really seems to, so there's multiple layers here. So we see the parallels between the plot lines, right? So we see this projection here, but there's also the parallels to traversing the unconscious, right? And I think in a lot of ways, Mastermind and Kali represent sort of the dark side of the unconscious. Like that is the gateway to accessing the dark side of the unconscious. And the fact that there's a big neon sign staring at us in the room where Kali is that says spiritual advisor sort of hits that very, very well home.
Yeah, I think it's really important with Stranger Things to pay attention to the background, because there are so many, I don't know if you want to call them Easter eggs or not, but so many elements that provide a commentary on what's actually happening within the story itself.
Oh, absolutely. I was listening to your first episode where you guys were talking about all of the posters. And so guess what I'm going to do? I'm going back to look for posters because it hadn't occurred to me. So there's a few things that I've seen in the background that have really, connected to my interest, right? Like I said, I'm very much into psychoanalysis. So I see all of those things happening. And then you talked about the posters, and now and I'm a big music fan too. So I've been connecting to that music a lot, which is pretty wonderful.
I love the music.
Oh my gosh, the soundtrack of this show is just awesome. It's just awesome. Yeah. Oh, I totally forgot to mention, and this is going backwards. When Elle goes to the city in search of her sister, it really feels like she's on a different planet, that she's in a different galaxy, right? Like that lined up for me as well. The way that she has to travel really far from home to a sort of different planet in order to experience this journey within her psyche.
It is a journey.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and it's one episode, right? Like season 2, episode 7 is this space where she goes on this, almost Odysseus-like journey, right? She is very much our hero walking in to this other space. Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned that the other characters are the X-Men. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So Mike is Cyclops. He's the primary love interest. He has this sort of unending support of 11, no matter what happens, even when 11 throws one of the boys across the junkyard, right?
Lucas.
Lucas, yeah. Mike is still 100% there, to defend her. And that's exactly what Cyclops does in relationship
with Mike. He is one of my least favorite characters. I find him really annoying because he has such a single-minded aspect, a singular vision, if you will, a cyclopean vision.
Exactly. The other ones that are really apparent is I see Jonathan very much as the Wolverine, right? So he's an incredibly physical character, but he's also sort of this grumpy outsider that is like reluctant to want to join, but then when he does, he becomes a very big hero, right? Like he turns into that hero. Who else do we have? Making connections. I mean, Dustin feels a little bit like Beast to me. I mean,
I agree with that.
Yeah, it's sort of like that high intellectualism, but then also the ability to sort of, burst out and do what needs to be done when it's necessary. And he's, cute and cuddly.
One of my favorite characters. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes.
He and the character Gaten Matarazzo, who plays him, has a physical deformity, which they consider. The bullies at the school call him a freak, but the other kids say that's so cool. It's like a superpower because he doesn't have collarbones and he has some. His condition doesn't allow him to grow certain bones and teeth and stuff like that. But the other kids say that he's like Mr. Fantastic in the way that he's able to contort his body. And of course, when we get to season 3, I don't know if this is really a spoiler, but watch out for references to Cerebro.
Oh yes, yeah. That'll be excellent. And season 4 is not out yet, correct?
Not yet, although the it was revealed a couple years ago that the first episode is going to be called the Hellfire Club.
Oh, wow. That's going to be pretty neat.
Yes.
It's exciting stuff. Yeah.
And this brings me to the topic of intertextuality, which is this idea that multiple texts kind of speak to each other. And so by reading one text, you gain a greater understanding of a different one because of references or allusions or some sort of dialogue going on between them. And we've seen this before in Stranger Things with, of course, the reference to X-Men 134 being a big foreshadowing element. We get it in the reference to the posters and how the posters refer to movies that have similar themes to what's happening in Stranger Things or to the different characters. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I love that you brought the posters back. So much intertextuality. You even mentioned earlier on about The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
right? So those influencing the story, the intertextuality that happens in Stranger Things is phenomenal. Because as you mentioned earlier, entertainment value is off the charts. My young niece is a huge Stranger Things fan, and she is consistently entertained without having any of these deeper understandings. But those understandings are so prominent and so overflowing that we couldn't cover them in a year, right?
Right.
But the posters are magnificent to me. It's one of the tools that I use as a writer in order to help indicate time, is to reference films. That in my novel, that's exactly how I establish timeline, because you don't want to come out and say it's 1983 in June. Right. And it also adds so much to go on, right? Like if you are familiar with the film, or even if you see that the film is referenced, then you find thematic links, like yes. To the Thing, right? Like it making those exact A to A, apples to apples comparisons that work immensely, not just for plot points, but for character development, right? So when you see posters for bands, right, like how does that band help to shape your understanding of who that character is? You understand the background of the band, that helps as well. I'm trying to think, I have to go back and look at all the posters now, because I feel like there's even deeper understandings that I need to have from those texts that are appearing. And television, they're just before Elle leaves her aunt's house or her mother's house to go find her sister, the TV has a logo for Channel 8. Yes. That's on for multiple seconds, like a 5-second, pass, which is quite a bit. And then the sister is 8. Yes. Right. So there's and that's a connected text within, yes. And then also the intertextuality that goes, beyond as well.
I mean, it's not just set dressing to establish the time period, although it does do that very well. Yeah,
it does.
But also there are layers of meaning in the set dressing, so that when you look at this stuff, like I said, if you're familiar with the Thing, then that helps you understand this text better. I don't know if you caught this, and in fact, I did not catch this until I was rereading it today, but in X-Men 134, that singular issue, there is a page where we see Beast, who is, at this point, he was originally one of the original X-Men. At this point, he's an Avenger, and he's in the Avengers mansion, basically on guard duty, listening for in case of emergency. And he's reading a book. And this is a book by Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not.
I'm not either. In fact, I decided to just look that up today. And he was or is a Princeton psychologist. And I barely understand this theory. And so I'm probably not going to get this right. But the theory is that prior to about 3000 BCE, humanity wasn't conscious, wasn't self-aware, that the two hemispheres of the brain were more separate than they are now. And so people would interact with the world according to what they thought were God speaking to them, but it was really one half of the brain speaking to the other half of the brain, and being perceived as hallucinations. And so, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I probably got this wrong, but the idea is that as humanity evolved since then, we've gained more self-awareness and the ability to reflect on our own experience, which has caused a decline in our mythology and reliance upon gods, and a greater reliance on ourselves. Do you think that relates here?
Holy cow. That is something else. What was the name of that again?
The book is called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
And who is the author again?
The author is Julian Jaynes. That's Jaynes.
Right. I'm going to have to look that up, because my goodness gracious, does that ever, that feels like the writers must have read that book before writing this series.
It was a best-selling book of popular psychology.
Yeah. It's a fascinating theory, right? And psychology is fascinating all the way around. And absolutely, the separation of the two parts of the brain equals the separation of the two parts of the psyche. Yeah. Kind of feels like what I've been saying since we started, right? That yeah, absolutely, it's an exploration of that concept in Jean Grey, the Dark Phoenix.
Yes, and so I thought that, speaking of intertextuality, that's sort of jumped out at me in my rereading of the text today. I'm like, oh wow, I never noticed that before.
Absolutely. Yeah, because if you were to read Jaynes and then read this issue, you would absolutely have a deeper understanding of what was happening.
I think so. Okay. Are there anything else that you would like to discuss or points you want to make?
Yeah, there's 800. But but in the time that we have for today, I think that this was really fascinating, right? I'm really interested. I do this with a lot of television, a lot of films and movies, that I feel there's so much more happening that we don't always, like most of, I would say popular culture, popular audiences don't always understand or even care to look for the reasons, right? These writers they're writers, right? They have reasons, they have ideas. And I love that we have the opportunity to sit here on a day like today and look for them and bring them out and think about, how much more this is than just entertainment, even though it is exceptional entertainment. We can learn a lot about ourselves, about pop culture, about literature, just through an hour discussion about TV and superheroes. It's great. It's great.
There is something meaningful to be gained from this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so homework assignment for this time. For the next episode, we're going to talk about Chapter 3 of Stranger Things, which is Holly Jolly. And for the special topic, take a look at SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, and we'll talk about those next time. Amee, thanks for joining us. Is there anything that you want to plug?
I only have one actual published book. It's called Greenhouse, the first 5 years of the Rust Belt Ruthke Writers Retreat. I was the editor and a contributor in that anthology. I can also be found in some anthologies with Alien Buddha Press, and I have lots and lots of stories and poems published online.
Awesome.
Right.
Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Until later, stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxham, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to Dread Pirate Productions gmail.com.